Recent books, however, by the Israeli author Tom Segev and the British historian James Renton accept the primacy of the latter propagandist issue. Segev's study, One Palestine Complete, Jews and Arabs under the British Mandate, proposes that the Balfour Declaration was the product of neither military nor diplomatic interest, but of prejudice, faith, and sleight of hand. The men who sired it were Christian and Zionist, and in many cases anti-Semitic. They believed the Jews controlled the world. There was no need, he writes, to seize Palestine in the context of securing Britain's access to India. Renton, in his otherwise excellent The Zionist Masquerade, The Birth of the Anglo-Zionist Alliance, 1914 to 1918, adopts roughly the same position. He writes, the decision to issue the Balfour Declaration was not driven by British strategic interests in the Ottoman Empire. It was rather part of the Allies' global propaganda conflict with the Central Powers, support for Zionism being a propaganda tool, based on the notion that world Jewry was fixed upon the restoration of national life in Palestine. Neither author makes any effort to argue against the alternative strategic imperialist factor. That case is simply dismissed out of hand. Given this recent bias in interpretation and the general absence of any documented argument for the strategic imperialist factor, it's to this latter issue that I intend to give special attention. I don't wish to imply any rejection of the propaganda factor, merely to suggest that it was the less potent of the two. It's also less pertinent to the concerns of this conference. I've divided the title conceptually into annexation and Zionization. This separation is not usually made, but is absolutely essential for proper analysis. Annexation did not depend on Zionization. The British did not annex Palestine to clear the way for a Jewish national home. Rather, it was the consequence of a sustained military movement, initially defensive, latterly offensive, eastwards from the Suez Canal, extending from early 1915 to late 1918. Zionization, however, did depend on annexation, an absolutely key point. Zionist leaders like Chaim Weizmann having a very clear sense of their reliance on Great Britain's support, and in particular on her defeat of Turkish and German forces in the Near East. In short, annexation was the key determinant, Zionization the dependent variable. Annexation was energized almost exclusively by strategic considerations. As for Zionization, this was also to a degree strategic in relation to the seeming desirability of having a grateful developmental European colonial settler ally on the exposed eastern flank of the canal, seemingly all the more urgent given intensifying anti-British nationalism in Egypt itself. So annexation, the crucial move, wholly imperialist, and Zionization, the dependent factor, partly imperialist. It was possible for a member of the British government to be an annexationist but not a Zionist, thus Lord Curzon, or to be a Zionist but not an annexationist, as with, perhaps surprisingly, Arthur Balfour himself, who flirted for a time with the idea of the United States taking charge in Palestine. Usefully for us, however, the man who had the overriding authority and who took the final decisions on such matters, the Prime Minister Lloyd George, was both an annexationist and a Zionist. And these are our three dramatis personae. David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister between 1916 and 1922, an imperialist with a decidedly Eastern perspective on the war. Arthur Balfour, the Foreign Secretary between 1916 and 1919, and previously Conservative Prime Minister 1902 to 1905, and Lord Curzon, George Nathaniel Curzon, Balfour's successor at the Foreign Office 1919 to 1923, and prior to that, a leading member of the War Cabinet. So what of the imperial factor? The key concern, as I've suggested, was the security of the principal sea route to India. Subsidiary imperial concerns related to the accessibility of British possessions in East Africa, East Asia, and Australasia. And there's also a good deal of discussion about possible railway construction between the Palestine coast and the Persian Gulf. And so by that sea route to India, the British having been thoroughly alarmed before the war by the implications of Germany's proposed Berlin to Baghdad line. Commenting on British policy generally in the Middle East and its borderlands in the immediate post-war period, Lord Curzon, as Foreign Secretary, commented, "You ask, why should Great Britain push herself out in these directions? Of course, the answer is obvious. India." The British imperial historian John Gallagher observes how, quote, war had brought back to power obsolescent imperialists, as it was to do again in May 1940. Indeed, it would be hard to find any more imperially minded government in British history than Lloyd George's. The collapse of the German, Russian and Ottoman empires provided a vast bargain basement for empire builders. Gradually since the 18th century, and uniquely for an impoverished land of non-white settlement, India had become enormously valuable to Britain in economic, political and military terms. On the eve of the First World War, it provided the United Kingdom with its principal overseas commodity market, a valuable source of raw materials and foodstuffs, an entirely secure field for massive government and railway investments with guaranteed returns that crucially had to be paid in sterling, a balance of payment surplus capacious enough to cover as much as 40% of the deficits that Britain was accumulating in its dealings with the rest of the world, most notably with the rapidly advancing and damagingly competitive industrial economies of the United States and Western Europe. Also, it provided the world's largest standing army, this for use not only in India itself, but in other seemingly troublesome parts of the globe, including the Middle East and indeed Palestine itself. And that vaporous but essential factor for a great power, prestige, the self-serving semblance, however fictitious, of potent, unchallengeable authority around the world. And all this was available at no direct cost to the British taxpayer, the Indian population itself footing most of the bills through land taxes and customs and railway charges. It was the best long-term imperial deal of all time. Now, I propose to examine the workings of the Suez-India factor mainly in the limited time available by quotations, public and private, from a number of the interested parties. It's a sort of opinion survey among what James Renton terms the foreign policy elite, a small group of individuals within the British government and establishment which in the main sprang from the same social, educational and cultural milieu. Their declared concerns can, I believe, be taken more or less at face value, and they do, I would suggest, constitute a critical mass. The first formal presentation to government of the case for a Jewish national home in a possibly British Palestine was made in March 1915 to the Liberal Asquith administration by Herbert Samuel, one of Asquith's cabinet ministers, himself Jewish, and after the war the head of the first British civilian authority in Palestine. His argument rested heavily on strategic considerations, insisting, as he later recalled in his memoirs, that the moment Turkey entered the war, the position was entirely changed. If Palestine was to be given a new destiny, Great Britain, with her important strategic interests in the Middle East, was directly concerned. The territory critically bordered on the Suez Canal. Any other European power so close to the Suez Canal would be a constant menace to the essential lines of communication of the British Empire. And 2 years later, at a meeting with Jewish leaders in London, it was minuted, Mr. Herbert Samuel desired to draw attention to the strategical aspect of Palestine. It was of enormous importance that the territory should not fall into the hands of another power, which might be enabled to threaten the security of the Suez Canal and Egypt. And some months before the declaration, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Reginald Wingate, advised the Foreign Office of the need for prompt military action in Palestine or Syria to acquire undisputed political control over territories which command vital lines of communication with our Eastern Empire. In Lloyd George's initial 5-man war cabinet set up in December 1916, 2 men were quite explicit about imperialist motivation: Lord Curzon, a past Viceroy of India and the government's best informed individual on Eastern matters, and the Conservative leader and future Prime Minister Andrew Bonar Law, the latter effectively Lloyd George's deputy in the cabinet and also